To my left is Don Rypkema. Don is surely the preeminent thinker in the United States, I would say, at the intersection of historic preservation and economic development. He's the principal of Place Economics and Heritage Strategies International. He's worked all over the country and indeed all over the world. He has a lot of accomplishments. I'll note he's an active member of ECOMOS, so thank you for that, Don. And among other awards, Don is the 2012 recipient of the Louise DuPont Crown and Shield Award. For those of you not from the United States, that's the highest award in U.S. historic preservation. So it's an honor to have Don, and Don's firm is a sponsor of the conference, and his colleagues have been among the moderators and doing excellent work, so you've probably met a number of the Place Economics team. To my immediate right is Ester van Steekelenburg. Esther is a Dutch-born urban planner, an Amsterdammer, am I right? But for the last 20 years has been working in Asia, Hong Kong-based, working with governments and property owners and developers and communities, helping make the business case for historic rehabilitation and helping people think how to leverage and valorize the historic assets that they own. And then our anchor today, Mike Buhler, who you met yesterday. Mike is the president and CEO of San Francisco Heritage. Mike, I think when I introduced you yesterday, I used San Francisco Heritage's former name, San Francisco Architecture and Heritage. But you got a flavor yesterday of the kind of exciting work that Mike gets involved in. Mike was previously with another venerable citywide historic preservation nonprofit, the LA Conservancy, and we also share a resume credential. We're both former in-house lawyers for the U.S. National Trust for Historic Preservation. So we really have an all-star panel, and I wanted to reintroduce them to you in part just to brag on them because we're proud to have assembled them here for you today. So our final panel of the symposium is entitled Leveraging Living Heritage for Economic Prosperity. And we got a little flavor of this rich and complicated topic yesterday during panel 2 when we alighted for a moment on the topic of tourism. And tourism is certainly a dimension of this question of the intersection of heritage and prosperity, but only one. But you saw how multifaceted that conversation is, and this panel is going to look at some similar themes. Surely, intangible heritage is a community asset, right? The accumulated intellectual capital, the tradition, the wisdom, the practice of the community. That capital can be leveraged for prosperity, economic development. So sometimes it's leveraged, but not by the people that could have practiced it. It's appropriated. So there's questions of kind of who benefits from it. Sometimes it can drive gentrification and other factors that then ultimately end up undermining the preservation of the intangible heritage itself. We sort of kill the goose that laid the golden egg. Hopefully what this panel will alight on is a win-win strategy where the conservation of a community's intangible heritage can also promote equitable prosperity for the community. And so with that, we'll kick off the panel, and in our decision about the order, we'll start with Don Rypkema. Don?
Thank you very much, Andrew. Mostly untrue, but appreciated just the same. When we had the discussion 10 days ago or 2 weeks ago with Claudia and Shannon and Andrew, we got very specific directions. This is not about theory. This is about practice. Don't go be talking about no theory. And I'm probably the least theory guy in the preservation movement, so I know that Shannon and Claudia never worried about me moving in that direction. But I've also learned over the years that once you have the microphone, you can talk about whatever you damn well please. So in fact, I am going to talk about so I don't know if it's theory, but some kind of basic premises, some of which I have just used as a foundation for my thinking for 3 decades. Also, however, some have been spurred about my thinking about this area, this intangible heritage area, which is not an area that I generally address. And so what I'm going to try to do is give you some of these basic premises. They are subject to disagreement, and you're free to say, I don't believe that one, but it's just a way to kind of frame how we think about this issue. And then some kind of fundamental concepts that are in the last recent years are really evolving. And finally, some of the findings that we have found in city-level studies over the last 2 years that may kind of reflect this kind of cultural heritage. So that's what I'm going to do in 15 minutes. First, and it's been a long premise of mine, is that place and location are not synonyms. That location is a point on the map. It's an intersection of longitude and latitude. But every place has to have a location. But not every location meets the test of being a place. My first premise. The second, and I don't know why I didn't stumble on this when I started thinking about this issue decades ago, but it really is the intangible that makes a place out of a location. Nobody ever says, oh, this place has a great sense of location. It's a sense of place. And I'd suggest to you that maybe I'm wrong on the molecular level, but that in fact our five senses that create the sense of place are really intangible things. Smell, sight, even touch, which maybe is the most tangible, but touch is different. It's crinkly, or it's hard, or it's soft, or it's hard, or it's whatever, cold, hot. But so I'd suggest that our five senses are really intangible contributions to our life. The next one is that value requires knowledge. So if I sit here and hold up a $10 bill, you can immediately say, well, geez, I could buy lunch with that $10 bill, and you're right. But if you did not know that this was a piece of currency that you could spend, if you didn't have that knowledge, this piece of paper with ink on it would not have value. But it doesn't apply just to economic value. It's all kinds of values. So if we value something and we think others should value it, they cannot value that if they don't understand it. If they don't have knowledge of why it's valuable, why it's important. The next premise is that meaning requires memory. Now, I want you to do a little thought experiment. So think about something in your life that has meaning to you. So I don't care what you thought of. You might have thought your spouse or God or your church or your job. I don't care what it was. But now take away your memory and try to conceive of that having meaning for you. And it would not. For a thing to have meaning requires to have memory. And heritage buildings are the physical manifestation of memory. It is that physical thing, that tangible thing, that in fact keeps that memory. So think about this wonderful story you've been hearing about for a day and a half about the malt house. I remember I went there after the football games. I had my first date, buying a soda there. It was that memory that it wasn't a stupid building. It was the memories that building held for people that made it important. I'd suggest to you that the tangible heritage, and that our firm works mostly in measuring things that we think about in terms of the tangible heritage, but I'd suggest to you that the tangible heritage really enhances the meaning of the intangible heritage. These young women drummers in Salvador Bahia in Brazil, they could play their drums in front of a strip center at the suburban San Antonio. Wouldn't be the same. That in fact that intangible tradition there is enhanced by the physical tangible heritage within which it's placed. We talked about this in a lot of fashions yesterday, but I'd suggest to you there is no stasis. There is no constant. Things are either getting better or they're getting worse. Nothing stays the same. But the issue is, and more challenging one, what in fact does better mean? Or what does worse mean, and for whom? And that really is kind of central to all of this. And for what? Is it getting better or worse economically, socially, environmentally, culturally? In fact, those getting better and getting worse may be different answers for different people on difference of those for what, which makes all this an even greater challenge. Resilience is critical for cities and for nations. Again, this is mostly, I never saw the stupid word resilience until the last couple of years when working with Ege and with Andrew and others in ICOMOS about this kind of emergence of resilience as a thing. And so I started to try to parse out the difference between resilience and sustainability. And the best distinction I found was this one, where sustainability aims to put the world back into balance. Resilience looks at ways to manage an imbalanced world. Now, if we just think about some current headline issues that need resilience, they're going to need resilience. The kind of after effects of the 2 major hurricanes. It's going to take resilience for those cities to come back. The protest in Charlottesville. It's going to take resilience for that city to, in an imbalanced world, to kind of make sense of itself. Post-conflict Syria. Think about the resilience they're going to take a great, 4,000-year-old civilization to come back into being. The rebirth of Detroit requires resilience. The sea level change, huge risks to lots of places, but Galveston and Miami and Newport, all really central issues. And because Ege's here, and I know it's a heartfelt issue for her, even the kind of re-establishment of secular democracy in Turkey. All of those are current events that are going to require resilience. I'd suggest to you that cultural heritage, both the tangible and the intangible, are really central components of both sustainability and resilience. I don't know how many of you know this, but this is the Mostar Bridge in Bosnia. And it was really interesting because for centuries, on one side of the bridge was the Christians, on the other side were the Muslims, but the bridge was the connector. It was used every day. It really was part of it. Well, early in the Balkan Wars, it was destroyed, and I'm sure there was probably some, military strategy reason for destruction, but also had real symbolic meaning. It was this severing of the relationships between the Muslims and the Christians, represented by the Mostar Bridge. So not an accident that one of the first reconstruction things for inclusion, for healing, was from the World Bank and lots of international aid organizations, the reconstruction of the Mostar Bridge. And again, I'm so glad that Shannon reprinted Andrew's wonderful essay. I hate being nice to Andrew, but I'm going to force myself to do it. Because that really what this is about, is that all these places around the world they're in conflict, whatever level, that need healing, then we ought to look to our cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible, as a mechanism to support that healing. And then in terms of these kind of evolution of concepts, for 30 years or 35 years, the concept of sustainable development has been this Venn diagram of environmental and social and environmental. But it really is, as we speak, in a rapid change of definition. And largely now among the Europeans, but even a place where we've worked, where Ege's worked, and Rodney and I and our firm has worked in Abu Dhabi, they have the concept called Estidama, which is their version of sustainable development, and they have added culture to that a diagram, that culture, apart from the others, needs to be part of a really comprehensive sustainable development. So those are the kind of premises that I'm thinking of and operating in. And I want to give you 2 other kind of sets of lists. One is the World Bank is just increasingly involved with and understanding the importance of cultural investment, cultural heritage in the investments that they're making. And they have identified as the contributions of cultural heritage to development as these: in livability, competitiveness, inclusion, and resilience. And then if we add to that the 4 kind of components of the revised sustainable development: social, economic, environmental, and cultural, I want to use those 8 things roughly to frame the findings that we've had in the last few years. In the last couple of years, we have done city-level studies on the economic, the impacts, economic and other, of historic preservation here in San Antonio, in Raleigh, in Pittsburgh, in Savannah, in New York City, in Cincinnati. And so what I've tried to do is just take a couple factoids from a variety of those studies, and put them in that framework of the kind of 4 things that the bank has identified and the 4 things that constitute sustainable development. And these are kind of fungible. Lots of them could fall into another category, so it's rather arbitrary. But just to give you an indication of what's happening, and this concept of revealed preference is my colleague Carla's kind of new favorite concept, revealed preference. And let me tell you what it means. I could say to you, how many like vanilla ice cream best, how many like chocolate ice cream best? And you'd raise your hands, and 60% would be 1 and 40%. So that's stated preference. I like chocolate better, I like vanilla better. But there's another way we could determine that. We could have a waiter come in with a tray of ice cream, and part of them chocolate, part of them vanilla, and you pick one of the others. Well, that's revealed preference. So everybody gets their ice cream, and then we could count up who picked vanilla, who picked chocolate. That's what revealed preference is. And so a lot of our analysis tries to use what people are doing as a reflection of, in fact, what they prefer. So start with livability, of course, the thing with wide definitions. This issue of walkability. Now, I know most of you know this, but there's a thing called walkscore.com. You can go on, type in any address in America, and it will give you a walk score from 1 to 100 on how walkable it is. Higher score, more walkable. So we did this in the study we did in Raleigh. The city of Raleigh has a walk score of 29 and falls in the category of car-dependent city. The historic districts overall have a score of 75. The local historic districts, 82. If walkability is a livability issue, and it certainly is, well, the historic districts are just blowing them away. You're in San Antonio. Again, one of the things about livability is proximity. So one of the measures we looked at is how close are people to the public school? And with what share of the households are within a quarter mile of a public school? Well, more than a quarter of all of the houses in all of the local historic districts in San Antonio are within a quarter mile of a public school. Less than 5% of the rest of the city. Again, for universities and for the libraries, the same edge, this contribution of proximity to livability, where again the historic districts are coming up. The issue of resilience, I guess this would be measured in lots of ways. Here is the city of Pittsburgh. As you all recall, at the end of 2007, we had a giant real estate crash in the U.S. that affected the entire rest of the world. And so the time frame of this particular graph is really the fall and the gradual recovery over a 6-year period of the number of real estate sales in Pittsburgh. You can see that both, and the blue line, the top line is in the historic districts, the bottom one is in the rest of the city. And you can see, the big hit came, they both declined in activity, but the historic districts immediately started to recover in terms of activity, and they continued to cover all the way, where the rest of the city kept going down, and when it did recover, it didn't even get back 6 years later to the point in terms of activity as it was at the start. That is resilience. That's a business resilience, but it has lots of other ramifications as well. My friend Kara Bertrand, who was kind enough to work for me until she dumped me, but for 2 or 3 years worked together. And so this is one of her slides actually that we both use a lot, but I teach at Penn in the spring, and I don't know Philadelphia well, but I remember going up right after the census data from the 2010 census, and big headlines in Philadelphia, we've finally turned the corner. 50 years after losing population, we finally started to grow again. It wasn't very much, 8,500 people, but at least we've turned the corner, except they hadn't. The historic districts in Philadelphia gained 12,000 people. The rest of the city was still bleeding population. That is resilience. Same thing happened in Pittsburgh. In the city over that decade lost over 9% of their population. The historic districts in Pittsburgh grew. That's resilience. Here is the construction industry in New York City. The green line is activity in the historic districts. The blue line is new construction. Real estate crisis hits. What happens? The new construction industry just dived. Little blips in the historic district, but real stable. It just kept on going through the ups and downs. That, again, is kind of resilience. Issue of competitiveness. Here again in Raleigh. Raleigh, if you don't know, it's capital city of North Carolina. Lots of universities, lots of growth, economic prosperity, research triangle, lots of stuff happening in Raleigh, including lots of new construction, really good new construction in the downtown. But almost half of the new businesses that started in downtown Raleigh, in fact, opened up in historic buildings. and another 20% in buildings, old buildings that just weren't designated yet. So again, this economic competitiveness was enhanced for the historic buildings. We started, not because an old guy like me understands anything, but because I have a smart young staff. In Raleigh, we looked as a new kind of measurement. We looked at Yelp and said, what are the favorite restaurants in Raleigh based on Yelp? And then we looked at those, and almost half of the most historic or most favored restaurants were in historic buildings. Historic buildings can't be 5% of the total buildings in the city of Raleigh, and yet half of the favored restaurants. So it's not just about the food. Clearly, it's the ambiance that's being created by the building. I also love the photograph on your left is only in Raleigh could you have valet parking for a barbecue place. But then the really important issue of inclusion. And again, this just emerges everywhere. And it's one of those things I think is important because it's a myth breaker about what historic preservation is. Too often still. When you say historic preservation, the response is, oh, that's that movement to save the mansions of rich white guys. Well, it ain't. So we looked here in San Antonio at the income distribution in the city as a whole and in historic districts. And here the red vertical lines are what's true in the historic districts, the blue in the rest of San Antonio. And the most important thing here is that the lines are a virtual mirror. Who lives in historic districts is virtually the same as who lives in the city of San Antonio, with two kind of statistical exceptions. There's more of the lowest income and more of the highest income who live in those historic districts. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing that rich people and poor people, in fact, live in the same neighborhoods. Here is the racial makeup in Raleigh. Again, sizable African-American population, but the distribution of that population, white and black, is virtually the same in the city. That this role of historic districts being a mirror of the city, I think, is a really important and under-recognized contribution. And again, this is revealed preferences of where people are. Here's the racial distribution in Pittsburgh with the same answer, that the share of white and share of black in the city with the sizable African-American population is the same. Then the social issue. Again, you kind of stretch definitions, but how much your family has to spend on stuff has economic consequences, but also real social issues. And what's happened in the U.S. in the last decade or so is a real recognition that it's not just the cost of housing, whether rent or a mortgage payment, that you have to really get the affordability issue, you have to add housing and transportation. And the kind of threshold you're called housing burdened if over half of your income goes to some combination of housing and transportation. So decidedly different. This happened to come from Pittsburgh. Between the share of housing plus transportation in the historic districts and in the rest of the city. Here is a fabulous finding. Again, every place has been true, every place we looked, but here's the San Antonio numbers. Is that this issue of foreclosure, this huge millions of people lost their life savings in the real estate crisis. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their property foreclosure. We looked at the foreclosure rate kind of in the depths in the recovery of the Great Recession in San Antonio. Every single one of San Antonio's historic districts had a lower rate of foreclosure than did the city as a whole. Every one of them. Now, those of you from San Antonio, you know there's huge variation in terms of income within those historic districts. Some of them very rich, some of them very much the opposite of rich. Didn't matter. That wasn't the variable. A historic district had this economic resilience, social resilience of foreclosure. Huge difference that HUD and FHA and banks and realtors should be paying damn attention. This is a huge difference. And then the kind of economic resilience. This, just as an aside, this is a picture of kind of manufacturers to the wholesalers to the retailers, all in one little stall in the fabulous souk in Aleppo that isn't there anymore. Jobs in Savannah. In Savannah, about 30% of all of the jobs are in the historic districts, but small firm jobs, almost half. Over half of all of the startup firms are in the historic district. Again, revealed preferences. And I don't care what you read in the Wall Street Journal, it is small businesses that are backbone of the economy in the U.S., and where there's revealed preferences of those businesses are, in fact, in historic districts. Tax delinquency. And we can talk about economics in the private sector, but it's also true in the public sector. You got to pay cops and teachers and fix potholes. And so in Pittsburgh, we looked at tax delinquency in the historic districts and in the rest of Pittsburgh. Again, few of these were rich districts. A lot of them weren't at all. But in fact, a tax delinquency rate almost half. And then the environmental side of things. Pittsburgh, that almost the half of all the building permits that were issued were for rehabilitation. And if you don't understand the connection, the environmental difference between building new or rehabilitating, then corner my colleague Carla Bruni, and she will tell you ad nauseum how much difference it makes in terms of the environmental side of rehabbing instead of building new. In a more kind of absolute direct measurement of the environmental thing, Mayor Bloomberg, before he left as mayor of New York City, wanted to set New York on a path to be the most green city in the world. And good businessman that he was, he said, first of all, first thing we have to figure out is what's happening now. So he ordered the survey of the energy use of all kinds of buildings, tens of thousands of them in New York City. This wouldn't have damn thing to do with historic preservation. This had to do with who's using energy. Well, lo and behold, contrary to what we've been told, frankly, by the environmental movement for decades, you got to get rid of those old buildings. They're energy hogs. They're wasted energy. They're just wrong. They lied to us. For 30 years, the environmental movement's been lying to us. The ones who are using the least energy per square foot, in fact, were the buildings built prior to 1920. Every decade subsequent, using more energy, not less. And then finally, the kind of cultural side of this. In Savannah, 30% of the people who live in historic districts also work in historic districts. Now, that has really kind of connection. So, you're carrying that cultural connection from where you live to where you work. But it also has a huge thing about resiliency. Think about this ratio in Miami or in Houston. The people who are living, how long is it going to be before the people who are living 8 miles out can get to their job, especially in the biggest times of crisis? And yet, if you're living and working in the same place, huge difference in kind of capacity. And then this issue about, kind of where the growth areas are. Here is New York City. In fact, in the city of New York, about 8% of all of the jobs are within local historic districts in New York City. 20% of the jobs in the arts and entertainment and recreation areas in those things. 2.5 times the kind of norm. Again, reveal preferences. People in those creative and knowledge-working activities prefer to be in historic districts, and that has all kinds of cultural significance to it. Here, we talked, and Andrew mentioned it, talked about tourism, and you'll notice it's the last on my slide. I mean, there's lots of positives and negatives about it. But what is true, when we did the study here in San Antonio, is almost 60% of people who come to San Antonio and stay overnight would fall into the heritage visitor category, and almost half of those who just come in for the day would fall in that category as well. So what all this means, I think, is this. That if we think of those World Bank characteristics of what cultural heritage does, it meets those tests. If we think of the sustainability, it meets those tests. So the whole point is there really are quantifiable, measurable evidence of this contribution of both the tangible and the intangible heritage. Thanks very much.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Esther. I will spare you my last name. Very difficult to pronounce, although you did a good job, Andrew. While I wait for the slides to come up, I'm going to share with you a little, this is San Francisco. I'm going to take you to Asia. I'm Dutch. And I'm from the city of Amsterdam. And I just want to share with you a very tiny story of conciliation, perhaps. I've shared it with some of you, but not everyone. When I was walking here along the river walk, obviously it reminded me a lot of Amsterdam, all the canal houses there. And I just want to share with you that in the 1960s, there was a plan to fill in all the canals of the cities of the city of Amsterdam. In those days, it was very fashionable to become a modern city, and they really wanted to turn them into highways, underground parking garages, and really turn Amsterdam into a modern city. What would you need those old buildings for? That plan lost with 1 vote in the city council. And up to today, I can tell you that every single person who is somehow associated with Amsterdam, who is either a resident, who has a business there, or who's been there as a tourist, still is very thankful to the day of today that proposal lost. But even I'm just going to share it because even in a city that is so well known for taking such good care of its heritage and have a lot of policies in place to keep the city center very livable and lovable, even in those places, at some point in time, heritage was being contested. And this is kind of something that I've taken with me when I went to Asia about 20 years ago. And it would be great if we could move there with the visuals as well. I moved to the city of Hong Kong and fell in love with Asia and never left. So have progressed my professional career there. And kind of gradually living there, trained as an urban planner, I became much more aware that there is a lot of value in historic districts, which, as I said, in Holland was contested only for a very brief period, but never really after that. I became so frustrated with the fact that all over Asia, these neighborhoods were disappearing, that I kind of made that my professional life. So I'm going to share with you a couple of visuals to introduce Asia to you. So this is the mission of what we do. We want to keep heritage alive for a vibrant and viable urban future. And I'll come back to those words later. If you guys think of Asia, you think of, people with straw hats, paddy fields, a particular type of architecture. But I'm going to share with you what Asia looks like in reality. And I always do this little exercise when I have a presentation somewhere, and I ask my Asian audience to tell me which city is this. So who has a guess? Which city is this? Well, people from Hong Kong would say it's Hong Kong. This particular building is actually in Singapore. Then I ask the same question. This is Jakarta. This is Manila. And this is Hong Kong. Yeah, but they all look rather similar. Okay, but then they say, okay, this is modern office buildings. They have to meet certain standards, etc. Okay, fair enough. Then we move to residential. So we do the same thing. This is Hanoi. This is the Javanese city of Surabaya. And this is in Bangkok. And this is in Hong Kong. And, when I look at this, and someone in the audience once said, okay, it actually looks more like a Spanish villa. And that is true. It has, in Asia, cities are starting to look increasingly the same. And, okay, fair enough. But what is really so worrying is that there is very little reference to what once was there in terms of architectural heritage. This is a picture from Yangon in Myanmar, where you see what happens with the type of architecture that surrounds the buildings that really display, what a magnificent city that once was. The point I'm trying to make very quickly is that throughout Asia, the urban identity is getting lost in the urban jungle. And it's happening at a much faster rate, I believe, than anywhere else in the world. And why is that? What are the underlying reasons for that? Well, one is that governments aren't really in the driving seat. So there is very little investment when it comes to the public infrastructure. And here you see electricity wires, but when it comes to roads, to pavements, to public squares, etc., there's very little investment that goes into that direction. Just collection of waste. I mean, this is an alley in between two historic properties in Yangon, and just see the sheer amount of waste that is just being dumped there. Also, there's very little government investment into the upkeep of historic buildings. Now, it's not necessarily that local governments wouldn't want this, or that they don't feel it's necessary, but they simply don't have the financial capacity, nor kind of the muscle power to maneuver. I mean, there is no city in Asia that has the luxury of having a heritage conservation office like you guys. There hardly is ever budget for regular maintenance, because the way that government finance is structured is that local governments rely very much on intergovernmental transfers from national government. So it's national government that drives the priority, and why would they care about what's happening in one particular city? And there is I'm amazed by all the discussions about tax credits here, because a local government in an Asian city would hardly ever collect a lot of tax as a municipality. So limited sources of revenue. Okay, so if the government is not doing it, then who is doing it? Well, definitely not the private owners. I mean, owners of properties, there are no things like, credits or other incentives, financially or otherwise, carrots or sticks, to entice property owners to do the right thing for their property. Which means that if a developer comes along with an attractive value proposition, then you go with that. And, financially, it is hardly ever interesting to preserve an old building in the short term. In the long term, it might be, but that is when you need a common ground. You need more people to care than just that owner. So that's a difficult one. Okay, then we've got the people who do passionately care, the people in civil society, in heritage groups, in organizations. And both Don and I work a lot with these people. They are the drivers of change, but they can only do so much. And their voices are not really loud enough to compete with the jackhammers. Plus, they don't talk the language of money, of economics. So for them, a developer is almost always the enemy. And a government is very often also the enemy. And that is what was so fantastic yesterday when I saw, 3 people from the city of San Francisco sitting here, and kind of the advocacy organization and the city planners, and, very harmoniously. Would never happen in Asia. Okay, so these guys are campaigning and they're trying to do the right thing, but with very little leverage, very little result. So developers can be in the driving seat. And what happens that if a plot is vacant or if a building is collapsing, and this is a city or a visual of the city of Galle in Sri Lanka, then a developer can probably do whatever they like with it. There's also very little in terms of real regulations that would prevent that from happening. And I'm just going to share with you what is the outcome of that. So what happens to buildings? This is a market in Hong Kong. And what happened with that market is they just built something on top of it. And, it didn't really fit in the slide, but this building is kind of 50 stories high. And although the developer says, we've preserved the markets, it's beyond recognition. People wouldn't, if you would walk past, it's just become part and parcel of this big real estate development. Streetscapes are just erased. This is a district in Shamshipo. This is what they build on top of it. And at street level, you would never even be able to tell anymore that what once was there, because even the street level is lifted to podium level. This is in Wan Chai, and another part of Hong Kong, which a city that, and I think this goes back to the issue that has been discussed a lot here, and what Don also alluded to, memory. This is a street, not particularly interesting, but has a lot of very good memories for people because it was wedding card street. It was the street in Hong Kong where couples would go before they would get married to order their wedding cards. So there were a lot of printing businesses printing wedding cards. That street has been developed into this. It's still a wedding-themed destination, but it's all the original tenants have been kicked out. It's all quite high-end boutiques now. It's a roaring success with tourists, but the fabric, the collective memory has all disappeared. Street life is disappearing. This is a picture of a Dai Pai Dong, like a typical street side eatery, this is the type of image that you all have in mind when you think of Asia. There's only 24 left because licenses are being rejected. This is because they wanted to make the city more hygienic and more clean. And they're being replaced by food trucks. Now, I think food trucks here, this is part of your heritage. It has nothing to do with Hong Kong's heritage. This is not a hawker stall food truck. But honestly, this is what the government is now doing. These street kiosks, this was very much part of the Hong Kong fabric. Again, no more licenses for these street kiosks. They're all gone. Signage. This is what you think of when you think of Hong Kong, these beautifully hand-painted signs. In the interest of public safety, within a year. These two pictures were taken within a year, and within a year, it's gone. The neon signs. Again, this is a primary avenue in Hong Kong in 1970. This is the same street in 2016. They're all gone. Again, in the interest of public safety. Worse than this, in China particularly, there are a couple of cities where they really just take the facades of heritage and use it as a backdrop for tourists. So literally, the whole population is being kicked out. It's being polished, it's being preserved, so they can tick the boxes for preservation. But everything that belongs to the fabric, to the identity, is gone. And what they are very good at is building it new. So when you go to Ocean Park, a wonderful theme park, that is where you can still find old Hong Kong. But you have to go to a theme park. It's incredibly popular. Everybody wants to walk here. Again, we call it kind of the Disneyfication of heritage. And one more image, just because I'm Dutch. This is in Malaysia, in Malacca. There was never a windmill in Malaysia. There really never was. But today it is there. It's been kind of planted in. So this is, it's not all negative what's happening in Asia, but these are some examples that I come across every day, and this is the environment that I operate in. Now, I'm not at all negative because I think there's change coming, and there's change coming from really particular groups in society. One, and that gives us all hope, I think, is a young generation. So I don't know who of you has heard about the umbrella movement in Hong Kong. So that was 2 years ago when suddenly people stepped up and said, okay, government, you may want to do things differently. It was related, the trigger point was democracy and Big Brother China watching us increasingly, but it was a big outpouring of loss of identity. Are we losing our language? Are we losing our identity? Are we losing our city? And you don't see this movement just in Hong Kong. You see it in Bangkok. You see it in Hanoi. You see it in Yangon. It's young people who are just sick and tired that their cities are looking the same as every other city. And their governments let the city be ruled by developers. And they want to hang on to what was theirs. And interestingly enough, it is the young generation. What is another interesting phenomenon is a young generation of developers. So these developers that I'm talking about in Asia are very often family businesses, and they have been run by the patriarch of the family who founded the business, made a lot of money. And they've since, this is very recent, I think up to 5 years ago, it was the 80-year-olds that were still in the driving seats and were making all the calls. Only very recently, there's a new generation that has stepped up. And they've been enlightened, for lack of a better word, because of overseas education. They came here to study, or Australia, or the UK, or Holland, you never know. And they've come back, and they see that things can be done differently. That office buildings do not always need to have a marble lobby and an underground parking garage. That you can also do things differently. And it's these guys who can actually make change happen. They understand that people want to live, shop, eat, work in a place that they feel comfortable, that they can relate to, and that travelers also want to have a local experience. Right? So this is exactly the same concept, but looked at it from 3 different dimensions. There's a lot of creative entrepreneurs that, like Donovan says, you know, they want to be in historic districts. They want to be in buildings with character, in neighborhoods with an identity. It's literally not all about the money. So it is with these kind of people that I think are the driving force for building the business case of preservation in Asia. How to make it... The key is how to make it relevant for contemporary urban society. And how do we do that? Well, at my little firm, we do that in many ways. And I had planned to talk about some of these things, but I completely changed my presentation because of the conversations we had yesterday. Because this... a lot of work that we do is similar to what Donovan just explained, but it's only very few occasions that you're lucky enough that the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank or a bilateral agency steps in and says, oh, let's make a heritage management plan, or let's try to draw up legislation, or let's try to think of what kind of economic incentives, you know, we can create in this city. And we do that type of work, but it's only... you know, in very few cases that you're lucky enough to be able to do that work. And very often there is no money and there are no resources. So you have to be innovative, you have to be creative, and you have to go with where the energy is, where the driving force is. So that is when my little entity thought up iDiscover. And iDiscover is a little passion project of ours that we've been doing on the side for about 3 years, but it's increasingly taking over all our time. 1, because it is a lot of fun, and 2, because it is actually, I think, it's much better value for money than many of these big studies that we're doing in terms of achieving the objective, of creating that awareness about the economic value of heritage in these 3 particular target groups that I talked about. So what is it? It looks like this. This is the last example that I have with me, so I'm for the highest bidder. It's a neighborhood guide of a particular neighborhood in an Asian city. It's a combination of an app and a map. And it is not about the hippest or the latest, because for that there's tons of other travel guides out there. It is about the spirit of place. We have started doing this in Hong Kong, are gradually, organically expanding to some other places. So we are now also doing this in Macau, in a couple of cities in Indonesia, in Myanmar, and recently Thailand and Manila. What is unique about it is 3 things. 1, it's created by locals. So it is not us as outsiders who decide what goes into the neighborhood guide. It's the locals. So we are just the facilitators. We're not the curators. They are the curators. They pick 20, 30 sites that they feel are unique for that particular neighborhood in different categories. Could be a building, but it could also be an event, or it could be a particular dish or a shop. You can imagine how much fun it is to curate these things, because there's a lot of passion that comes out. So it's created by locals. The maps are designed by locals. So in every neighborhood, we find a local designer who then draws that map. And that gives a unique kind of flavor to it. Because it comes with an app, the designer can also be very free to design, because the map doesn't need to carry a lot of information, because the information all goes into the app. And they're powered by locals. And with powered, I mean sponsored. So in order for us to be able to do this, in every neighborhood we find a sponsor. So we started off with cultural foundations that gave us grants, etc. But increasingly, in every neighborhood, we find one of those groups that was always considered the enemy, the developer, the hotel owner. They will put up the money, and they do it either for marketing, from a marketing perspective, or from a corporate social responsibility perspective. I mean, they want to be positively associated with that neighborhood. And that's why they sponsor this. And it's not a lot of money that we ask, because it's a relatively quick process. So that means that you've got something that is created, powered, and designed by locals. And I think that is really the unique selling point of this. More than just the product, it's the process, in the curative process that really, really brings the value. And I'm just going to share with you a last couple of slides that show that process. So it's a tool for kind of community-involved mapping. And it has really progressed, because we started with these neighborhood maps, and then suddenly people started coming to us and they said, can we also do a route that is just on food? Or can we do one of all the art galleries? So it's a really demand-driven process. And if you have the template in place, you could tailor routes for specific audiences and representing a specific demographic or a specific group in society. Just another visual of how we do documentation. So increasingly we have started using the curative process already as a community outreach tool, and that works magic. It's really empowering for these civil society groups that we work with. So be it a street association, be it a creative collective, be it a university, be it a heritage group, remember, they are the ones who care, but they're not being heard. And suddenly, because they have a product that the government doesn't have, because the government doesn't have an app, but they have an app, and they suddenly grow in confidence and they're taken seriously. And I didn't really see this one coming, but it's a real big confidence builder for those people who are really struggling to keep heritage alive. Then it's a perfect tool for engagement. So when we launch these things, we typically organize some events around it, treasure hunts, Insta meets, whatever the audience that we want to speak to. Well, it's not often that kids in Asia have a day out with the family, and that they're doing something that's both educational and fun. So it's really being appreciated. We have a lot of return visitors who come to our events. We use it also to organize some other activities around it. This is a building workshop for kids where we ask them to rebuild replicas of the buildings that they thought were important for a neighborhood. I think we had 200 cardboard structures there, of which only one was a high-rise building. Only one. Engage, this is definitely for a different audience, but for the young, digitally connected, this is massive. We literally have, thousands of people following us on Facebook, on Instagram. They all want to be photographed in in front of old buildings, and they, it's really, how do you show your identity? This one I love, connect the newcomers and the people who've been in the neighborhood for a long time, because they're together on this map. It's not exclusively old building. It can also be new entrepreneurs who've come to a neighborhood because that neighborhood speaks to them. And because of this, they need to speak to each other. There's a dialogue. They have to become good neighbors, or at least, we can start that dialogue with this. A dialogue across different generations. This is brilliant. This is in Manila. And I don't know if you can see it, but the older couple on the right-hand side, they're in their 70s. They own a beautiful Art Deco building that was just used as a very ordinary kind of office buildings with currency traders, etc. in it. He had one floor empty and noticed that there were a lot of hipsters, a lot of young hipsters that came to take photographs of his Art Deco building. And at one point in time, one asked, "Can I rent a space?" And he said, yeah, sure, rent a space. But you have to pay rent, you understand that. You young, creative hipster. Yeah, okay, I'll pay rent. And he paid rent, and then he called his friends, and they all came, and before he realized it, he had a whole floor full of hipsters, architects, creative design studios, all of that. And then they said to this old man, "What are you doing with your ground floor space? Can we do some retail pop-up, a coffee shop there?" Yeah, difficult. Anyway, they persuaded him, cut a long story short. They are now the best of friends. This building is a huge success story. Roberto, his name is now going to his buddies who also own properties in the street to convince them to do the same thing. And it works, and it has skipped a complete generation. It's like grandma and granddad with their cousins, and they have meetings together, and they run a building together. It's beautiful to see, and it kind of started with something like this. We encourage people who visit a place with this map in hand to spend their money locally. So don't, of course you can go to Starbucks if you really want to sit in air condition, but just spend that $1 that you have at a local shop. And we tell them how. The language is there. You don't need to be afraid of food hygiene. You can actually sit there in that little street stall. It's okay. Inspiring a new generation of craftsmen, especially through the events that we organize through this, and the food traffic that comes to these old businesses. I mean, the neon sign guy got new orders in. The old printing shop, started printing Christmas cards for somebody who came by. It's not every story is a success story in there, but there's a couple of really, really beautiful gems of connection. And it inspires a dialogue with the haves, with the developers. And I realize I'm wearing the same dress in the photo as I did today. But this was a dialogue with developers that also kind of started because, they became the sponsor of this, and we just used it as an excuse to start another conversation. And for them, this is important, branding. And if, you can try to brand anything in your life, but if you want to brand something that has stories, your job is a lot easier, right? So historic districts are easy to brand. And this is not part of this initiative, but something that eventually came out of it in Kota Tua, the old town of Jakarta. And to celebrate. Celebrate heritage and the spirit of place. Just want to share with you that in those just 3 years that we've done this, how many different partners we've been able to get together. So the logos that you see in the upper part are all NGOs, creative collectives, that type of organizations. And then we've got sponsors, we've got media partners. So, kind of online media, bloggers, vloggers that help us to spread the word. And Cathay Pacific, an airline. that says, okay, I like what you guys do. We give you free tickets, up to 10 a year we get only. But still, it makes a difference. So I'm really surprised at how this little initiative that has really started as a passion project has taken off, and apparently is ticking the right boxes for very different audiences. And if you can make heritage relevant for these different audiences, and I think you're doing an okay job. So that was my contribution. Thank you.
Are we on time? Okay. Good morning, everyone. While we're waiting for my slides to come up, I just wanted to revisit Andrew's joke about introducing me under our organization's original name, San Francisco Architectural Heritage. There's a little story behind that relates to this symposium. A couple of years ago, we rebranded as an organization, and about the same time, we were just launching our efforts regarding legacy businesses and intangible heritage. And we made a very deliberate decision at that time to drop architectural from our name. We found that the scope of our mission had become broader, and also the terminology, the word architectural, was a barrier in our efforts to outreach to underrepresented communities where we have not had a presence historically. So I'll note that among our longer-term members and supporters, it was quite controversial at the time. But everybody seems to have gotten over it by now, and there's absolutely no regrets. I really don't feel worthy of anchoring this stellar panel, but the examples that I'll share with you this morning really are both international and primarily San Francisco examples of smaller scale, community-focused initiatives, many of which have been sponsored by the city of San Francisco and could be potential models for San Antonio. And, in my past professional career in preservation, there's a lot of energy focused on heritage tourism. That's not what these examples are about. These, by and large, are about how to engage the community in telling the story of the significant places and businesses and intangible resources that define their character, and listening to them and deferring to them as to what they want to get out of cultural heritage-related programs and initiatives. Some of this will be a little bit of overlap from my lunchtime presentation yesterday. I did want to mention again the Sustaining San Francisco's Living History Report. I think I failed to note yesterday that the full report, the 52-page report, can be downloaded on our website. You can see the link there. It's pretty easy to find. And it's much more substantive and has a lot more content than I can possibly hope to cover here today, including 16 case studies, many of which relate to economic prosperity and economic equity. And I just wanted to note that as well. And Andrew and I were talking about my remarks for this presentation. I just reminded him that a lot of the focus of our work and the city's work in San Francisco has been on really economic equity and not so much economic prosperity. The two are related, of course, but overwhelmingly, the city's work, as Donna mentioned yesterday, in this area regarding legacy businesses is a reaction to the rapid wholesale change that the city is undergoing in an effort to kind of acknowledge and sustain the existing residents and businesses of the city. I'll just highlight one example that is profiled in the Sustaining San Francisco's History Report. And I mentioned it briefly yesterday as the inspiration for San Francisco Heritage's Legacy Bars and Restaurants program, and that's the Bares Notables program in Buenos Aires. This is really the only example that I think does have predominantly a focus on tourism. That might not be accurate, but it is administered by the Bureau of Tourism in that city. And you can see here, based on this quote, the New York Times has had a couple of articles on the program, actually, that I'd recommend. That it's not just the tourist destinations that have been designated through this program; it's also the more modest locations as well. But I just provide this as an example of kind of what San Francisco, I think, is still aspiring to in terms of what a fully fleshed out program might look like. And the Argentina program, like San Francisco, provides grants to businesses that are on their list. The grants, however, are not for rent, like in San Francisco. They're specifically for conservation projects. So there's definitely more than one way to approach grants to businesses. And they have a very kind of robust marketing component that enables businesses to install plaques, have window decals, and then supported, just like Esther's example, by app and online maps and social media, etc. And also there's a private partner, a community-based partner that helps promote the program as well. Getting back to what I mentioned regarding equity, I just wanted to revisit the Prop J and the Legacy Business Historic Preservation Fund in San Francisco. There were many opponents to the concept of providing grants to businesses when Prop J was put on the ballot. The local paper, the Chronicle, recommended a no vote on Prop J. The arguments of the detractors at the time were that this program would subsidize failing businesses. It would favor one class of businesses over another. Let's see, what were some of the other arguments against it? Subsidizing landlords was another common criticism of the program. But in the context of what was happening at the time, it was a relatively easy argument to counter the opposition. The city of San Francisco had many, or one in particular, tax incentive for attracting tech companies to the central market area of San Francisco, dubbed the Twitter tax credit. And that tax credit, for better or for worse, was very successful in attracting high-tech businesses into a particular part of San Francisco that had long been blighted, the mid-market area. But our simple response to the opponents to Prop J at the time was, if the city can invest to attract new businesses, certainly this relatively modest funding for our stalwart businesses that have defined our communities and employ residents for decades is definitely worth the investment. But it was not seen at the time as an economic development-related ballot measure. I'd say in retrospect, there's evidence that it has become that, so I'll get to that in just a moment. So I did reference this recent article by the San Francisco Business Times, which did not endorse Prop J either at the time. That came out just a few weeks ago, looking at how the grants to businesses have been used in the last year and a half. And you can see just how many businesses are participating. But of the 51 grants issued to date, 22, the majority have been used for capital improvements to their existing space. I thought this was an interesting quote that appeared in the article from the owner of a local bookstore who used his grant to replace light bulbs throughout the bookstore with low energy bulbs. And, his take on running a small business in San Francisco is it's survival by 1,000 improvements. And I thought that was a great quote. Obviously many other businesses have similarly used their grants, which are quite modest, of course, into making and reinvesting them into the capital improvements into the business itself. And then another business owner, the owner of a local hardware store, Cole Hardware, which is also on the Legacy Business Registry, noted that the designation is much more valuable to him and his business than the grants that they are eligible to receive under the program. And I think what he means here is both the political and the marketing benefits of having official recognition of your significance and your value to the community. In many cases, businesses that are seeking and receive Legacy Business Registry designation are about to enter lease negotiations or are in the middle of lease negotiations or are facing eviction. And oftentimes, the Legacy business designation really enhances their position from a negotiating standpoint. One thing I did not mention yesterday in terms of the application process to be listed on the Legacy Business Registry, the business first must be nominated by their city supervisor, the equivalent of a city council member here in San Francisco. And this is actually one of the most controversial aspects of the Legacy Business Registry in San Francisco. Critics said that it encouraged corruption and political patronage, and that only businesses that would that were friends of elected officials would be nominated for the registry. I don't think that has been the case at all. The maybe unanticipated benefit of that requirement has been it sends a message to the landlords that if they want to evict that Legacy business and charge double or triple rents, which happens frequently in San Francisco, that they are also likely going to come up against the city supervisor who nominated this business for the Legacy Business Registry. So invariably, if the supervisor has nominated the business, they are involved in some way in trying to seek a resolution for that business, whether it be staying in the existing space or finding a new location. Another city-sponsored program, which I think is relevant here, is the Invest in Neighborhoods program in San Francisco, which is housed within the Mayor's Office of Economic and Workforce Development. So definitely it is framed as an economic development related initiative, but it's much broader than that. And you can see some of its basic aims here. Its focus is on 25 commercial corridors throughout San Francisco. There's staff members within the mayor's office that are liaisons to those neighborhoods and provide a range of assistance. Here's a screenshot from their website in terms of they have a big menu of programs and services. So they'll provide technical assistance to the businesses. They'll also provide grants oftentimes for preservation-related projects. Here's a couple examples on Lower 24th Street, the Calle 24 Latino Cultural District. A recent project funded through the Invest in Neighborhoods in the mayor's office is restoration of this House of Breaks mural, a famous mural on 24th Street. And just this month in the Portola neighborhood, which is in South San Francisco, not really related to intangible heritage, but certainly related to overall neighborhood branding, is the restoration of the neon marquee at the Avenue Theater, which had been dim for decades. Another great aspect of this program are neighborhood profiles that are issued by the Invest in Neighborhoods office. So this is just the cover of the Lower 24th Street neighborhood profile, but there is a ton of information on demographics, rents, businesses that comprise the neighborhood, and is really a valuable introduction to anybody wanting to know about that neighborhood and its character, as well as its business climate. And it's, I think, a really valuable source of information. Another program that is not through Invest in Neighborhoods, but is supported by the city, is the Spotlight Chinatown project. Now, some of our conversations yesterday, we talked about, what is meaningful, at least the table discussions, what is meaningful mitigation for projects that adversely impact cultural heritage resources. And I think the Spotlight Chinatown project is a really good example. In San Francisco, for the last few years, large parts of downtown and Chinatown in particular, the streets have been ripped up for the Central Subway project, which will connect Chinatown with south of Market. And it has had a major adverse impact on existing businesses in the neighborhood. And the Spotlight Chinatown project, which is spearheaded by the Chinatown Community Development Center, a nonprofit that really does some incredible work, community-based work, in supporting the businesses and residents of the neighborhood. Its aim is to highlight and benefit the existing businesses in the neighborhood. Just one example of that is the Eat Chinatown exhibit, which I think this is a really small, modest project, but it's in some ways resembles what Esther has been doing. But it was. I really love this project on a number of levels. It was very deliberately focused on bringing generations together, engaging the older generations that are owners of these longtime restaurants and diners and bakeries in Chinatown, and introducing the younger generations to those businesses and getting them to appreciate them in new ways and their significance to the fact that the Chinatown community exists at all. They've played an integral role in early on, especially in establishing the Chinatown community and enabling immigration. But this project documents 10 restaurants, diners, and bakeries through photographs, obviously, but also through personal narratives and historic photos. And again, the focus is not on the tourist destinations, it's on the very modest mom and pop shops, the ones that are really impacted by the Central Subway project, but also the ones that are patronized by the community and multiple generations in the community. And the Eat Chinatown exhibit is no longer up. It was up earlier this year. It came down in April. But one really valuable and easy takeaway from the project is, and the photographs I'd say are just really beautiful. I could only include a couple here, but a series of postcards were created for each business based on the photos that were taken for the exhibit. So now, with the short amount of information on the back on the history of the business. So now those businesses, and as I mentioned yesterday, these legacy businesses are really proud of their story and love to tell it and love to share it with others. So now they have something that they can share with their customers, and something that's beautiful and something that is easily replicated for other businesses. And actually, San Francisco Heritage, we invited the director of the Chinatown CDC to speak at our recent membership meeting. We're hoping to build on the success of the Eat Chinatown project by nominating other businesses in Chinatown for the Legacy Business Registry and expanding that model and the postcards and enabling businesses to market themselves in that way. So that concludes my presentation. I just put up a couple shots of potential legacy businesses I came across walking around town last night. So hopefully those will get similar treatment. Thank you very much.